Speaking of nuclear reactors, I do believe fusion energy and the breakthroughs in fusion energy are our first topic today. And I think the people who ought to start that is Dapper and Landon. So if you guys want to
Yeah.
take it away with what the heck is going on and how fucking
Drum
impressive that
roll.
is, I took notes.
Ooh,
Wow.
dang. Chesh with notes. That's so hot.
So Dapper, you want to start, or I'll start? Either way.
So, I mean, I'm not an expert on fusion. I worked on fission reactors, which is the only kind of nuclear reactor that's currently like operating at a commercial scale for actual power generation. So, my knowledge of this is somewhat limited, and I will admit that I have traditionally been a bit of a fusion skeptic, not in the sense that I think it's a bad idea, but that I think that almost everything I've heard about, like, oh, great advancement in fusion power, has been overhyped. And so we're getting another story about a reactor that is allegedly essentially producing more power than it takes to run the reactor.
And it produced more energies than the lasers had deposited. About 2 megajoules in, about 3 megajoules out, a gain of 1 point.
Now, sometimes that's described as like it's outputting more power than is put in. That's technically not true because that's not how physics works. There's a set amount of energy and you can't get more out of it than was put in. However, what they mean is the power to run things like the containment fields and, all the keep everything at the right pressure and, basically keep the lights on at the fusion reactor. It's now producing more than that. Now, the thing is, though, I've also heard similar claims before that did not result in any obvious change in the state of fusion power. So I am cautiously optimistic. However, I have said it many times, as have others. Fusion is it's only like 30 years away, and it always will be. And I'm not sure that recent announcements are changing that.
So, I think much of what Dapper said is correct. I will take a slightly different approach, and part of it is because I am a fusion expert. I worked multiple years in magnetic fusion energy in the computer center. I worked under a gentleman who was very instrumental in developing uncontrolled fusion. And as such, and I've been also at the facility that is the ignition facility that came into news recently. I think Chess would probably say that the fusion energy research needs a PR agent.
Oh
That is
boy.
because they do things perhaps to get funding, perhaps to justify things and make promises that are akin to Elon Musk level promises. So let's talk about what actually happened, right? First of all, what the ignition facility is. The ignition facility, the National Ignition Facility, was designed to try and create, fusion in small pellets, particularly for understanding the nature of plasma as it's undergoing fusion. Right? Plasma, we know about plasma. You can see it in things like gas that gets excited and creates light and so forth. Fluorescent tubes and
Those little
other
balls at the museum where you put your hands on them and then your hair stands up on end, and then science.
Yeah.
Hey.
But when hydrogen starts to fuse, it becomes very weird, and particularly because one of the things that's integrally involved with hydrogen fusing is this thing called quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, I'd have to take you through 100 levels of weirdness just for you to understand what the game of quantum mechanics is about. That being said, what happened, right, in this thing? And the news is correct in that a very careful analysis of the energy necessary to initiate the reaction came out at around 2 megajoules, and reaction came up at just over 3 megajoules.
About 2 megajoules in, about 3 megajoules out.
So you might say that the effort to get the reaction started, to cause reaction, the reaction produced 50% more energy, and that is that's a requirement if you're going to have a power plant. You would not want to have a power plant where it takes more power to run the power plant than the power plant yields. That would be a bad. You would not have a good time, right?
Bad
You'd
economics.
be French frising rather than pizza, or is it the other way around? I forget. So the ignition facility achieved this, and one of the things in particular that the ignition facility is very good at is that it's creating. It's relatively simple to set up and modify the experiment parameters, as opposed to things like the tokamaks, giant magnetic donuts, if you will, where the setup is very difficult, and oftentimes you sort of get you don't have much in the way of parameters. You just sort of see what happens. Whereas with the initial facility, they can tweak things, and in particular, the area when I was involved in when the laser was called Shiva. And it was really actually was a nice thing. There was actually they actually had work with with some physicists from India as well that were involved in that thing, and they had a nice Shiva dancing god thing, in part because that time it was 92 lasers, or was it 96? 96 lasers coming in trying to all impinge focus on one spot where they put a hydrogen pellet. And what they found with fusion research is that, and I could say, is that if you try to brute force hydrogen to fuse, you end up failing, right? So other designs were created, and the current ignition design has a cylinder, if you will. Mm-hmm. This is like the cylinder like this, and what the lasers do is first of all much more power. And double the laser beams. The laser beams come in on both sides like this. They come in here, and what they do is they strike the inside of the cylinder. So you have a bunch of beams coming in this side and this side, and they're focusing in and striking the inside of the cylinder. And what the inside of the cylinder does is it reacts, sort of detonates, produces an X-ray front, and the X-ray shock crushes a little pellet about half the size of a BB that's centered inside this thing, and the X-rays impinge on it, crush that hydrogen down, and hold it there long enough for not only the pressure and temperature to achieve fusion, but the quantum mechanical effects to start, and they get what they call the nuclear people call it a burn, a good burn. So if you will, it's like they have this match, and when they strike it, they can actually have the match light. And the effort of striking it is only about 66% of the energy comes out when the match lights. Now, would this ignition facility itself produce a commercial reactor? Although some of my laser fusion people would disagree, it's not practical way to do a reactor, but it is very practical in how you and be able to understand how fusion works. And so this particular setup, they have ramped up and increased the efficiency by an order of magnitude, because they're able to learn from the reaction and tweak things. And so in some ways, the value of this system was that they now are able to take a fusion engine and actually go from a starter motor to have the engine turn over and run for a little bit. This is going to give us a really good information about how fusing plasma works, and that will lead us towards a better understanding of how to build the tokamak. And the magnetic donuts are probably by far the more practical design in terms of producing having an actual power plant. But the understanding of how plasma works is you need this smaller scale thing, because it's too difficult to just create these multi-billion-dollar tokamaks and say, they try again, wait a couple years. This system is going to give us a much better tweaking, and they're not by any means they're not finished with ignition facility, right? They're going to be studying these reactions and and pushing the level of how thoroughly the pellet fuses.
That makes sense.
So I would acquire this is I would liken it to say we've had our Kitty Hawk moment where
Oh.
we had a really good demonstration of powered flight with a human on board. Now, does this mean that next year we're going to be flying to New Zealand from North America? No, right? Commercial airlines and jets and so forth, that's down the road. But we now have a path to get there. So that's, I think, is a significant watershed moment. As to how long it takes, it still is. There's still a number of difficult things to go about, but now we can actually experiment with real fusing plasma. Before we had, we could have things stick to each other by slamming in, small bits slamming into an accelerator or detonating a thermonuclear bomb, but that's considered antisocial. And besides, that kind of uncontrolled fusion didn't give us really a good thing. I think in some ways, fusion research was sort of waylaid by that notion of a sledgehammer, right? The way you get hydrogen to behave is beat it with a bigger hammer, right? No, you got to finesse it, you got to caress it, and so this indirect thing of having halarium hit on the inside to generate X-ray shockwave to crush a thing was a more of finesse style. And so as to the road from going from having useful fusion reactions to having it being done on a sustained basis, I think that's the next road, which is to get the tokamaks learning from the inertial fusion people how to handle plasma. I know that, for example, ITER, the international tokamak in Europe has had some construction problems. They've had some issues of manufacturing, and I could regard it as good because they have an opportunity to learn from these experiments and perhaps tweak their design to get a better idea about that's the next level. Create a donut level of plasma that fuses and yields net energy. And then there's an engineering challenge beyond that to build something that's sustainable and understand the power thing. It will be, when fusion occurs, it'll be a really great game changer.
So is this
how
much of like a breakthrough is this? Is this like we're going to see fast changes now that we've done it once? We're going to be able to develop a little bit more quickly comparatively, since, science tends to be exponential and such?
I think, yes, I think there'll be fast changes in understanding and understanding the techniques of actual fusing plasma, because it's relatively easy for them to modify the design. They can change. Right now they're using deuterium, tritium. That's two isotopes of hydrogen. But there's also interest in seeing how they can get deuterium to react with itself. That requires higher temperatures, but they'll be able to see where they can get to that set. There'll be other factors that will allow it. So again, I liken this to, we've just had our Kitty Hawk moment in aviation, but we're a ways away from fighter jets, supersonic transports, commercial airlines, and so forth. But the one is absolutely necessary because now, for example, there's a number of commercial companies looking at fusion, and the Nation facility is publishing what they're learning from. So they're making it open for people to see what happens, so that they can also modify their designs to accommodate how fusion actually occurs. It's really hard to go into the sun and do experiments inside the sun. It tends to not be a viable option. And before, as I said, the uncontrolled fusion created conditions where in thermonuclear weapons, the temperatures and pressures are actually much higher than they are in the sun, and creates conditions that are not really useful to understand how to do it in a controlled fashion. Right, there's
But
no, and by the way, I want to make clear, fusion reactors are a totally different regime than bombs. It's a
right.
it's
Oh
a
yeah.
it's a vastly different thing. But what it means for the planet is an energy source that is carbon neutral, and that's quite abundant, particularly if they get towards the deuterium, because right now the tritium, you have to manufacture the tritium. We can do it. It's just kind of a pain, and it's slightly radioactive. Um, but as I said, this is really a watershed moment.
Right.
As long as the fusion people get a good PR agent to help understand, people understand stuff. Because you're right, the joke about down, fusion down the road is there because they did a bad job of PR.
Yeah, it sounds to me like basically they're at the starting point. They've just reached like the starting point, but they've had a bunch of false starts. And so
Yes.
now this could potentially be really big. However, you don't want to jump the gun. You need people. Science communication is very, very difficult. And so being able
Yes.
to express how important it is and why it's worth spending money on and why it's worth being interested on something without overblowing what you're capable of doing or how quickly you're going to get there. Setting a realistic
And
expectation, essentially.
Yeah, when
absolutely,
you
and
don't, you get jerks like me who just takes everything with a gigantic heaping grain of salt.
and so what the Dapper's reaction is fair and expected, right? Because in the past they've done things where they have sort of accounted for things like, say, well, the amount of energy that hit the pellet was less than the amount that the pellet put out. And it's like, well, that's not really, even though to get
Right.
energy to the pellet, they had to do like an order of magnitude more, right? So when they produced claims that make it sound important, or they produce claims that are hard for the public to understand. I mean, you talk about, well, they had a new record in tau factor, right? They don't communicate the science well. So the answer is yes, this is a big moment. Moreover, it's an experiment that's easy to repeat, and it's easy for them to modify and tweak and continue to up the set. It's not clear where the theoretical maximum is right now. They're doing 50% more of the energy necessary to run the reactor to the reactor produces. So it's we don't know where that level is, but that's going to be one of the items. The other business is how high of a temperature and pressure can they get to the point where they're doing deuterium reaction. Deuterium tritium tokamaks can work, but the other thing that the fusion people don't do well is they try to say, well, this is fusion, so we don't have all those nasty radioactive products that fission stuff. And they make it sound like that this is radiation free, and the answer is no. Fusion reactors will produce radiation. It's we do nuclear stuff, that's going to happen, right? But the good news is that the vast majority of stuff, you're not going to have the depleted fuel problems that the fission reactors have. You'll have radiation, but the radiation will be of things that are relatively short-lived, and that's so the whole waste problem that fission reactors have is not present in the fusion reactor. But they say things like, well, it's a mistake to say that fusion reactors are radiation free. Whenever you're dealing with the nucleus, you're getting radiation. That's just a given.
No way
I don't know,
going around that.
Oh yeah, no,
to that?
it's true. I mean, yeah, I do think one of the big problems I think with all nuclear options, fission included, is that there is just not enough public understanding with what radiation means, what levels of radiation are dangerous, what kinds of radiation are being put out by nuclear power, both those that are operating as well as hypothetical new devices. Like one of the things that I sometimes see is people look at some big number. I'm like, oh my goodness, this was 50 microsieverts. And I'm like, yep. Do you know what that means? No. And it's like, well, it's not much. I can tell you that. It's not gonna ruin your day if you get 50 microsieverts of exposure.
You'll survive.
Yeah, you'll be just fine. Have you ever taken a plane ride? So I think, to me, there's two big
Dapper being
barriers
sassy
to.
here.
Yeah, well, so there's two big barriers that I see to fission energy. The first is the technical side, and to be fair, I don't know a whole lot about that. Landon knows more than that by a lot than I do. I just know that I've heard a lot of big claims, and I've seen a whole lot of nothing coming out of that sector. So, you know.
Yeah.
But the other big barrier, which I think might, in the long run, be the bigger barrier, is actually just the public acceptance. Because one of the things is, I mean, if you look at fusion power right now, it doesn't have the theoretical awesomeness of fusion, but fission is currently the safest way to produce power, even when you include all of the nuclear accidents that have happened. It still has the lowest number of deaths per megawatt hour, and it also has the
Yeah.
lowest number of injuries per megawatt hour. It is and that's just by a lot, right? Like
Yes.
things like solar power and wind are many times more dangerous than a nuclear power plant.
Yes.
Many times more dangerous.
And coal plants are are far more radioactive.
Oh my goodness! Oh yeah.
Than nuclear plants. Even the ones that go foof, they're mismanaged, right?
Yeah, that coal discharge from the smokestacks, full of radiation, like you wouldn't believe compared to like when you see the steam coming off of a cooling tower in a nuclear power plant, there's basically no more radiation than there is above background. But that is not true for the stuff coming off of a coal plant.
Yeah.
So
And
I
so
think
some of the
that's
things like the oil shale stuff in Alberta
yeah,
has a very bad level of radioactivity in there. Sorry.
yeah.
Question from the
And so
chat
yeah,
is how does since you brought it up, is how does this new development affect how we should be approaching or should we be pursuing fission, if at all?
oh, I mean, we should definitely be pursuing fission, an expansion of fission, right? So
Yeah.
here's the thing, right?
Yep.
Global
Right.
warming is a big problem, and the only way to solve this is to take the like country scale power distribution networks that currently predominantly work on various fossil fuels, whether it be natural gas or coal or whatever else, and transition them to a combination of things that are renewable resources like wind and solar or geothermal or hydraulic or hydro, whatever, you know what I'm talking about, and nuclear. But the problem is that right now there's a big push to add renewable capacity, which is fine, but unless you have a reliable backup to that can fill in any power gaps without question, they're not going to work to actually provide long-term
Yes.
power to the power grid. So right now what happens is every time you get a new wind farm or a new solar farm, you build like a natural gas or a coal plant nearby to pick up the slack. That's not really going to cut it.
Yeah.
We need to replace that slack covering facility with nuclear power, or in places where wind and solar and other options aren't really great because of just geography. The only green option is nuclear. And yes, nuclear accidents can be disastrous, but I mean, so is just unchecked climate change from burning fossil fuels, and ultimately so is coal, and so is gas, and to a lesser extent, but still more so than nuclear power, so are wind and solar, right? Those still kill more people.
Sure.
So that's all I got.
And I like add to what Dapper excellent point that Dapper said. To have your energy policy and your energy systems need to be multimodal. If someone says everything can be done by blah, you can replace everything and just do tidal or whatever the thing is, they're giving you a Kent Hovind.
Bag of bullshit.
You need multiple sources. Some, as Dapper said, is because of like time of day stuff, where or seasonal stuff where you have variations. You need hydro and nuclear and and wind and solar and these other things. Other thing as well is that petroleum products have a valuable function. There are things you can only do with petroleum products that you can't do with something like a hydroelectric dam. Like, for example, building fertilizers or doing some plastics or things like that. There are things where we instead of stop wasting some of the petroleum products by just burning them, and start using petroleum products for things that they're unique for. And we've seen also that the problem with energy production is political, by and large.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Which
we've
is
seen this-
linked to political corruption and big oil stuff.
exactly
And the
right.
parties
And
and the governments
Yeah.
like quibbling with each other.
we,
Yeah.